The rain began quietly, a soft tapping against the window. June, sitting at her easel, hardly noticed at first. She was lost in the strokes of her paintbrush, blending shades of green and blue onto the canvas. The landscape of Connemara unfolded before her eyes, vivid and wild, with rolling hills and scattered cottages. Her brushes danced, capturing the essence of the day. But then something shifted. A gust of wind slammed against the old stone walls, rattling the window shutters. June stopped. Her heart skipped a beat. She placed her brush down gently, the wet paint on the canvas shimmering under the flickering light. Outside, the rain grew heavier. It became a drumming on the roof, relentless and thick. The world outside turned into a blur of dark clouds and swirling mist. The usual hum of the countryside was absent, replaced by a deafening silence. June stood, her feet bare against the cold stone floor. She walked slowly to the window, a feeling of unease creeping up her spine. The landscape she loved, the place she had lived for so many years, felt different. There was a strange heaviness in the air. The wind was no longer gentle, but violent, like something trying to break free. The trees bent under the pressure, their branches creaking ominously. June's breath caught in her throat. A shadow moved at the edge of the field, near the edge of the forest. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She leaned closer to the window, her face pressed against the cool glass. Her pulse quickened. The figure was unmistakable, a silhouette of a person, moving with unsettling speed. It stopped, just for a moment. She couldn't breathe. The figure stood still, as if it was watching her, its presence undeniable. June backed away from the window, her mind racing. The storm outside seemed to roar louder, as if the sky itself was closing in on her. What was it? Was she imagining it? The silence in the room seemed to thicken, swallowing her thoughts. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now felt like they were closing in. She turned back to her canvas. The colors on it looked wrong now, distorted, as though they no longer belonged to the peaceful landscape she had painted. She walked towards the door, her feet moving on their own, pulled by some unseen force. The handle was cold in her hand. The wind howled outside, rattling the door as she stepped into the hallway. Each step felt like it was leading her further into the unknown. The quiet house now seemed to hum with an eerie energy. June's mind spun as she reached the front door. It was as if the world outside was calling her, pulling her into the storm. But as her hand reached for the handle, she hesitated. A sudden noise from upstairs made her jump. A faint sound like footsteps. Her breath caught. Her breath caught. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the upper floor. It was impossible. She was alone. June's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She had been downstairs the entire time. The house was empty. She was sure of it. Yet, the sound grew louder, the distinct thud of footsteps growing closer. Her pulse pounded in her ears. For a moment, she considered running. But where? The house, old and full of history, seemed to shift around her. The air grew colder, heavier. She could almost feel the presence of something or someone just beyond her reach. She stepped back from the door and slowly turned, making her way up the creaking staircase. Each step felt like an eternity, each creak echoing through the house, as if it were an omen. The house was eerily quiet now, the storm outside almost drowned out by the pounding of her heart. She reached the top of the stairs, her hand gripping the railing for support. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence felt wrong. The corridor stretched out before her, long and dark. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She forced herself to move forward, her feet dragging on the old wooden floor. At the end of the hall was her studio, the room where she had spent countless hours painting, a place that had always brought her peace. But now it felt different. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the handle. It was cold, colder than it should have been. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room inside was dim, the only light coming from the flickering candles she had left on the table. But it wasn't the dimness that unsettled her. It was the figure standing in front of the canvas. A tall, shadowy silhouette, almost blending into the background. June's mouth went dry. She couldn't move. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence. Instead, it stood still watching the painting that June had been working on for weeks. The same landscape she had been painting earlier, the one now so distorted, so wrong. The colors, once calm and serene, were now twisted, smeared across the canvas as if they had been dragged in all directions. There was something in the paint, something unsettling that she hadn't noticed before. It was like the landscape was alive, shifting, almost moving in the faint light. June stepped forward, her legs shaking. She called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond, but then it slowly turned towards her, and for the first time, she saw its face. It was an empty void, a face without features, as if the very essence of a person had been erased. Her stomach churned. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure remained silent, but its presence grew heavier. It stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. June's pulse thundered in her ears. There was nowhere to run, no escape. The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward her. And in that moment, the storm outside seemed to scream louder than ever before. The figure's hand reached out, cold and empty, like the touch of a forgotten dream. June's breath stopped, her body frozen, caught in the terror of the moment. The storm outside roared, as if the heavens themselves were about to tear apart the world. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, rattling the house to its very foundation. But the figure didn't make a sound. Its hand hovered just inches from her skin, its fingers trembling, as if it too felt the weight of this terrible stillness. June's heart raced in her chest, louder than the storm outside. Her body screamed at her to move, but fear held her in place, as if the figure's gaze, if it even had eyes, was holding her captive. The air in the room was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, a pressure pressing down on her chest. Her vision blurred, as if the room itself was shifting, warping in response to the figure's presence. It was then that she realized the figure wasn't just standing there. It was pulling at the very fabric of reality itself. The distorted colors of the painting seemed to shift again, more violently now, as if the brushstrokes were writhing beneath her gaze. The peaceful hills of Connemara twisted into something unnatural, their edges jagged, their depths dark and oppressive. The sky was no longer blue but a deep, suffocating black, and the trees, oh, the trees, no longer swayed gently in the breeze. They reached upward like blackened fingers, clawing at the air. June staggered backward, but her feet didn't seem to obey her. She was trapped, caught in the surreal nightmare unfolding around her. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to run down the stairs and out the front door, but every step she tried to take felt as though the ground was pulling her back. The figure stepped forward, its motion slow but deliberate, like a shadow creeping across the floor. The coldness of its presence wrapped around her like a suffocating cloak, and she could feel the chill crawling into her bones. It reached out, its hand just grazing her arm. The touch was icy, more bitter than any winter she had ever known. Her body stiffened, the cold seeping deeper into her skin, until it felt like her very soul was frozen in place. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She couldn't scream. She couldn't even breathe. The figure didn't say a word, yet it felt as though it was speaking directly into her mind. "You have summoned me." June's heart twisted, a sharp pain that made her dizzy. Summoned? How? What did it mean? The walls seemed to close in on her, the air so thick now she could barely breathe. The figure stepped closer, its presence consuming everything until it was all she could feel. Then, the voice came again, but this time, it wasn't just in her mind. It was real. It was a sound, deep, chilling, like the echo of a forgotten promise. "You have disturbed the balance." The words sent a jolt of fear through her, and June's eyes shot toward the canvas. She saw it now, saw what was wrong with the painting. The figure wasn't just standing in front of it, it was in it. Its shape was slowly becoming one with the swirling chaos of color and shadow, as though the lines were bleeding together, fusing with the very essence of the world. "Your painting," the figure whispered. "It has awakened what should have remained asleep." June's vision blurred, the room spinning as the figure's voice seemed to ripple through her thoughts. Her body trembled, every inch of her consumed by fear and confusion. What had she done? What had she unleashed? She took a step back, her eyes locked on the figure as it slowly dissolved into the chaos of the painting. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend and twist, as if the world she knew was slipping away into some darker, unreachable realm. Her heart pounded violently as she reached for the door. But it was too late. The storm outside howled louder, and in that moment, June realized there was no escape. Not from the painting, not from the figure, and not from the storm that was now raging inside her mind. The door refused to open, its handle slipping from June's trembling fingers. Her breath came in sharp, desperate gasps as she pulled at the door again, but it didn't budge. The weight of the house, of the air itself, was pressing in from all sides, suffocating her. Behind her, the room seemed to shift. The edges of the walls began to blur, as though the very structure of the house was warping in response to the figure's presence. She turned back, her body forced by the invisible pressure that surrounded her. The figure had all but vanished, its form now entirely absorbed into the swirling mass of color on the canvas. But its voice remained, echoing through her mind, dark and distorted, as if it was no longer a thing of flesh and blood, but something far older, something beyond comprehension. It is too late. June's heart skipped a beat. The sound of her own pulse deafened her. Her surroundings became a swirl of shadow and light. She could feel it now, a pull, an invisible force, like the world was being drawn into the painting. The room was no longer just a room. It had become a part of the painting itself, its edges fading, blurring as if they had never truly existed. With every passing second, the storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind screaming, pushing against the windows as if the very earth was trying to tear itself apart. June stumbled backward, her head spinning, her limbs unsteady. She reached out, trying to steady herself, but there was nothing solid to hold on to. The floor beneath her feet felt soft, almost liquid, as if it were dissolving away, becoming part of the painting. She looked around desperately, searching for something, anything real. But the world had become an abstract nightmare, a twisted reflection of the peaceful Connemara she had once known. Her thoughts raced. She had to escape. She had to get out of the house before it consumed her completely. But then she saw it. In the distance, just beyond the swirling landscape of the painting, there was a figure. It wasn't the shadowy figure from before, no. This was something different. It was a figure of light, faint but steady, like the last remnants of a fading dream. June's breath caught in her throat. A way out. The figure was distant, but its presence was clear, comforting in its stillness. It beckoned to her, silently urging her to follow. With every ounce of strength she could muster, June began to move. Her legs were weak, her body heavy, but she had to go toward the light. She had to escape this twisted place, this nightmare that had swallowed everything. As she stepped forward, the ground beneath her feet seemed to firm up, the shifting liquid floor slowly solidifying into something more tangible. She reached forward, her hand outstretched toward the light. But as her fingers brushed the edges of the light, it flickered. The warmth of its presence vanished. And for the first time, she felt the deep, gnawing emptiness of the room of the house. The walls had disappeared entirely. The air was gone. There was no escape. Not from the painting, not from the storm, and certainly not from the figure. It had been there all along, waiting, watching. June turned one last time, her vision faltering. The figure, no longer a shadow but a towering presence, was there, right behind her. It reached for her once more, its hand now solid, its touch burning, searing into her skin. "Welcome home, June." And then, all went black. The darkness was overwhelming. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, no sense of anything at all. It was as if June had been swallowed by the night itself, her very existence lost in the depths of some endless void. But then, slowly, a faint light began to creep through the blackness, like a sliver of dawn breaking through the horizon. It was soft, barely noticeable at first, but it grew stronger, more distinct. June blinked, her vision adjusting to the faint glow. Her body, though weary and heavy, seemed to respond, urging her to stand. She didn't know where she was. The room she had been in, the house she had called home, was gone. In its place was a vast, empty space, endless and stretching in all directions, like an open sky. The colors that swirled around her were familiar but foreign at the same time, like the broken pieces of the painting, pieces of the world she had once known, now fragmented and scattered. She took a step forward, her feet tentative, unsure. The ground was soft, like a damp meadow, yet it felt solid beneath her. She looked down, expecting to see grass, dirt, or stone. But instead, she saw nothing but shifting shadows, dark and formless, swirling and changing beneath her. June's heart raced, her breath quickening as she realized where she was. She was in the painting. The one she had created, the one she had painted so many weeks ago, the one that had turned from peaceful hills to a disturbing, chaotic mess. But now it felt different. The storm, the figure, the eerie sense of dread, they had all melted into this strange, liminal space. And yet, there was still something unsettling about it. Something wrong. She moved forward, feeling an overwhelming pull, like the world itself was beckoning her deeper into this space. Her steps were slow, measured, as she tried to make sense of the landscape around her. The hills, once a peaceful green, were now dark and twisted, their edges frayed and jagged. The trees no longer reached toward the sky. Instead, their branches curved inward, as though the very life of the land was being consumed by something unseen, something sinister. Her eyes darted across the scene, searching for any sign of movement. The figure, the voice, the thing that had haunted her. It was still here. She could feel it, like a presence hovering just beyond her reach, lurking in the corners of her mind. And then she saw it. A faint silhouette, standing in the distance, just at the edge of the darkness. The figure was taller now, its form more distinct, and as June stepped closer, she could see that it was no longer a shadow. It was a reflection of her. Her heart dropped. It was her, but not her. A twisted version of herself, distorted and hollow, like a mirror image that had been shattered and reassembled. The figure didn't move. It only stared, its empty eyes locked onto hers. And in those eyes, June saw something she could never have imagined, something cold, something ancient. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure spoke, its voice not from its mouth, but from within her own mind. "You created this world, June." Her heart skipped a beat, her thoughts swirling in confusion. "You brought this upon yourself." June's hands trembled at her sides. She couldn't look away from the figure. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, the shadows closing in, as if the very space she stood in was folding, bending, collapsing around her. The ground beneath her feet quaked. "You're the artist," the figure's voice echoed again, hollow and distant. "And you are the one who must live with the consequences." June's knees buckled. She sank to the ground, her mind spiraling. She had painted this. She had created this nightmare with every brushstroke. It was her fault. She had summoned it, had opened the door to something she could never control. The figure began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, its limbs stretching, bending unnaturally as it advanced toward her. Each step was like a ripple through the space, the very fabric of the world bending with its movements. June's chest tightened. She tried to move, to run, but her body was paralyzed. She couldn't escape. It was coming closer, closer, and then, just as the figure reached her, everything went silent. The air stopped moving. The shadows stopped swirling. The ground beneath her feet became solid again, and the sky above, though still dark, seemed to clear. And in that moment of stillness, June understood. This place, this nightmare, was not a punishment. It was not a trap. It was her creation. She had painted it into existence. And now, she was part of it. Forever. The silence pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, as the figure stood before her, its form now perfectly still. The unsettling sensation of being both part of and separate from the world she had created made June's head spin. She could feel it, the weight of the truth, heavy in her chest. She had not just painted a landscape, a scene of serenity. No, she had given birth to something much darker, something that had always been inside her, waiting to come to life. The figure, a twisted reflection of herself, remained unmoving, its gaze unwavering, fixed on her. June's breath was shallow, her heart a frantic drum in her chest. She tried to speak, to ask why, to beg for understanding. But her voice was lost, trapped somewhere deep inside her, swallowed by the stillness of the space. The figure slowly reached out with one long, skeletal hand, the fingers stretching toward her, its movements deliberate and unnatural. June could feel her pulse in her throat as the hand hovered just inches from her face. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered, its voice both inside and outside her mind. It was cold, distant, yet intimately familiar. "You have shaped this world. Now you belong to it." Her body trembled, but she stood frozen in place, unable to pull away. The truth settled over her like a blanket of ice, numbing her limbs, suffocating her thoughts. The figure's hand brushed against her cheek, its touch like a wave of cold water, seeping deep into her skin. Her body jolted at the sensation, a shock that cut through the numbness. It was a touch that didn't feel like a touch at all. It was as though it were reaching into her very soul, tearing it open. And then, the world shifted. The ground beneath her feet cracked, splitting open like a broken canvas, the shadows beneath her curling like smoke. The trees that had once been twisted and gnarled now seemed to writhe, their branches reaching out like clawed hands, scraping the sky. The figure smiled, a slow, chilling smile that stretched across its hollow face. "You're not alone here," it said, the words like a poison in her veins. "This world will consume you, and when it is finished, there will be nothing left of you but a memory in the paint." Her chest tightened, a sharp pain radiating through her ribs. The figure's voice echoed in her head, its laughter mingling with the screech of the wind. She felt the walls of her mind closing in, the world folding around her, until there was no space left for escape. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of it all. Her hands pressed to the ground, seeking anything solid, but there was nothing to hold on to. Only the darkness. Only the twisted reality of the painting. A voice, a faint whisper, broke through the chaos. "June." It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. She looked up, her eyes wide, desperate for a glimpse of something familiar. And there, in the distance, a figure appeared. Not the twisted reflection, but someone, something different. The light surrounding it flickered like a candle flame in the wind. June's heart leaped, a spark of hope igniting deep within her chest. Was this a way out? A way to escape? She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her, and stumbled toward the light. The figure remained still, waiting for her, its form now clearer. It was human, but not entirely. The edges of it seemed to blur, as though it were something between worlds. "Come to me, June," the figure whispered. It wasn't the voice of the figure that had haunted her. It was gentle, soothing, almost kind. And for the first time since everything had begun, June felt something other than fear. She took a step forward, and then another. But as she drew closer, the figure began to fade, the light dimming, the darkness swallowing it whole. "No!" June cried, her voice breaking. She reached out, desperate, but the light was already gone. The space around her shifted again, becoming darker, colder. The figure was gone, and in its place, the familiar shape of the twisted reflection returned, stepping forward from the shadows. "There is no escape," it whispered, its voice laced with finality. The landscape around her twisted once more, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. The storm, the darkness, the figure, everything came crashing down all at once. June's heart sank as she realized the awful truth. There was no light. There was no way out. She had become part of the world she had created. A world that was never meant to be. And now she would remain here forever. Trapped within the boundaries of the painting. Trapped within the twisted brushstrokes of her own making. The darkness closed in around her, its weight pressing down on her like the hand of an unseen god, suffocating and absolute. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she fell to the ground, her palms scraping against the cold, shifting surface that had once felt like solid earth. The paint beneath her hands was wet, sticky, almost as if it were alive, pulsating with the rhythm of her breath. But even in the thick, oppressive dark, she could feel the presence of the figure, looming just out of sight, its cold gaze never leaving her. She knew it was watching, waiting, its existence tied to the nightmare she had created. It had always been there, in the brushstrokes, in the colors, in the hidden spaces between the painted hills and the swaying trees. She had opened the door, and now she was bound to this world, to this endless cycle of despair. "You cannot run," the figure whispered, its voice swirling around her like the wind in the empty halls of the house. "You have painted yourself into this place, June. This is your world now, and you will live within it forever." Her chest tightened. The words hung in the air like a curse, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to lash out at it, to tear the very fabric of this place apart. But the power of the painting of the world she had summoned was too strong. It was as if every breath she took, every movement she made, was an echo of the colors she had bled onto the canvas. The world itself seemed to hum with the force of her creation, vibrating with a sinister, unseen energy. And yet, there was something deeper than the terror that gripped her. Beneath the cold touch of the figure's presence, beneath the storm that raged inside her mind, June felt a spark. It was small, weak, but undeniable. A flicker of something she had nearly forgotten: defiance. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into the shifting surface, the dampness of the paint clinging to her skin. The world, this nightmare, was her own. And though she had no idea how, she knew she could fight it. "I won't stay here," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible in the stillness. "I won't be trapped forever." She pushed herself up, her legs unsteady but determined. The darkness around her seemed to part, just a little, as if it had heard her resolve. Her eyes scanned the landscape, the twisted hills and gnarled trees, the empty sky above. There had to be a way out. There had to be something, anything, that she could use to break free from this place. As she took a hesitant step forward, the air seemed to shift, the ground beneath her feet trembling, as if the painting itself was responding to her defiance. The trees around her groaned, their limbs twisting and stretching like they were alive, like they were trying to reach out and stop her. But she didn't stop. Another step, and then another. The figure, the twisted reflection, appeared before her, blocking her path. Its hollow eyes stared at her, emotionless. The air grew colder with every passing second. "You cannot change what you've done," it said, its voice like ice. "You are part of this now. You belong here." But June didn't listen. She couldn't listen. She had no choice but to push forward. With a deep breath, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the thick, shifting paint that had once been so familiar. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything she had created, everything she had caused. And then she whispered a single word: release. The word hung in the air, a fragile, desperate plea. But something happened then, something that she couldn't understand. The world around her seemed to shudder. The ground cracked open, and the trees twisted, their branches snapping as if the very land was rebelling against her command. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening crack, the sky split open. The figure recoiled, its face twisted in an expression of anger or fear. She couldn't tell. The world around her began to unravel. The colors bled together, the lines between earth, sky, and shadow blurring until there was nothing but a swirling vortex, a storm of paint and chaos. And in the center of it all stood June, alone. But for the first time, she felt something other than fear. She felt free. The storm raged around her, the swirling vortex of color and shadow expanding, growing larger, consuming everything in its path. The air was thick with the sounds of splintering wood and cracking earth. June stood at the heart of it all, her body trembling, yet her mind clear, focused. She had done it. She had summoned the chaos, but in doing so, she had torn open a path, her path. The twisted figure loomed at the edges of the storm. Its presence felt more than seen, a dark silhouette against the whirlwind of colors. But it did not approach. It only watched, its hollow eyes filled with something like resignation, as if it had finally understood the truth. June had broken free. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It had turned to liquid, rippling with the dark hues of the painting, as if the very landscape was rejecting her presence, trying to pull her back into the folds of its creation. But June didn't flinch. She felt no fear. Instead, there was only the burning need to move forward to escape. She took a step, then another, her body steady despite the instability of the ground. With each step, the vortex around her seemed to slow, its furious energy beginning to unravel, disintegrating like old paper in the wind. "You cannot escape me," the figure's voice echoed through the storm. It was not a whisper anymore, but a loud, commanding roar that vibrated through the very fabric of the world she had painted. "You're mine. You have always been mine." June paused, her heart racing. The words were like a rope pulling her back, but she resisted. She was no longer the painter, no longer the creator of this nightmare. She was the survivor. She was the one who had the power to tear this apart. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with strength. She closed her eyes, and with a deep, steadying breath, she extended her hands outward, palms open, toward the storm. She felt the pulse of the painting beneath her fingertips, the chaotic energy of the landscape that had once bound her now begging for control, for dominance. But June wasn't afraid anymore. She was not trapped. She was not bound. Release it all, she thought, her voice a silent command in the whirlwind. "Release me." The storm froze for a heartbeat. The world around her began to disintegrate, the swirling colors evaporating into nothingness. The twisted trees, the fractured earth, the storm, everything started to crumble away like ash in the wind, fading into the void. For a moment, the silence was deafening. And then, like the calm after a great storm, the world around her cleared. June stood, breathless, at the center of a vast emptiness. There were no hills, no twisted trees, no sky filled with ominous clouds. There was only a pure, empty canvas. It stretched out in all directions, endless and white, the raw foundation of the world she had created now devoid of all its former horrors. And yet, she didn't feel alone. In the distance, a soft light began to glow, faint but steady, like the first rays of dawn breaking across a dark sky. It was warm. It was gentle. It called to her. June's heart swelled as she took a step toward it. She felt no hesitation now, no fear, only the quiet certainty that this was her next step. As she moved forward, she felt the weight of everything she had experienced, everything she had become slew off of her. The nightmare, the painting, the twisted reflection of herself, it was all fading, becoming nothing. The light before her grew brighter as she drew closer, and when she reached it, she understood. This was not just an escape. It was a new beginning. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped into the light, the world around her transforming in an instant. The emptiness, the chaos, the nightmare, all of it vanished, and before her lay a landscape bathed in soft, golden light. The hills rolled gently in the distance, their curves familiar yet peaceful. The trees stood tall and strong, their branches reaching toward the sky as if in gratitude. It was Connemara, her Connemara. But this time it was different. It was not painted. It was real, alive, whole. And in the midst of it all stood June, the painter, no longer bound by the world she had created. She had broken free, and now, at last, she was truly home. The air was fresh with the scent of rain, the soft patter of drops falling from the sky as the storm passed. She breathed in deeply, feeling the peace settle around her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, June smiled. The light around her softened, embracing her with a warmth she hadn't felt in so long. The sky above was a soft gradient of dawn, tinged with shades of pale lavender and gold, like the first rays of the morning sun peeking through the last remnants of a passing storm. The landscape stretched out before her, vast and open, with the familiar hills of Connemara rolling gently in the distance. But this time, there was no turmoil in the air, no oppressive weight. Everything felt balanced, serene. June stood there for a moment, just breathing it all in. The world she had created, the world of fear, of shadows, of her own tangled emotions, had dissolved, leaving only this peaceful, untouched place. The vivid green of the grass seemed to glow with a vibrancy that she had never seen before, and the trees, their leaves glistening with droplets of rain, seemed to sway with the melody carried by the wind. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. The tension that had held her captive for so long seemed to melt away, replaced by something more profound, a sense of peace, of belonging. She was no longer just the painter. She was no longer trapped by her own creation. She had freed herself, and in doing so, had reclaimed the world around her. Her heart beat steadily now, not in fear, but in wonder. She could hear the distant call of birds, the soft rustle of the leaves in the wind, the gentle murmur of a stream that ran through the valley. It was all so real, so pure, as if the very air itself had been washed clean by the storm. As she began to walk, her steps light and sure, she felt a quiet joy that she hadn't known in years. It was like rediscovering a place that had always been part of her, waiting for her to return. She reached the edge of the hill and looked out over the vast expanse of Connemara below her. The land was bathed in golden light, its beauty breathtaking. She had always known it was beautiful, but now, with a heart unburdened and free, it was more than beautiful. It was a symbol of renewal, a testament to her journey, both the struggles and the triumphs. For the first time in what seemed like forever, June felt truly alive. And as the sun began to rise higher, casting its warm glow over the land, she knew this was where she was meant to be. Not just in Connemara, but in this moment, free from the grip of her past, from the world she had created with her own hands. She was no longer June the painter, haunted by her creations. She was simply June, and in this quiet, peaceful landscape, she had found her place. The world had opened up before her, and she walked forward, one step at a time, into the light of a new day. As June walked further into the landscape, her every step felt lighter, as though the earth itself was welcoming her, guiding her towards something yet unseen. The soft hum of life in Connemara seemed to wrap around her like a blanket, distant birds singing their morning songs, the rustling of the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the quiet gurgle of the stream winding its way through the valley below. She let her hand brush lightly against the wet leaves of the trees, their surfaces cool to the touch, still kissed by the remnants of the rain. The air was fresh, invigorating, and carried with it the scent of the earth, wet soil, sweet grass, and the soft perfume of wild flowers scattered across the hills. Her heart still beat with a quiet rhythm of wonder, each breath a reminder that she was no longer trapped, no longer bound by the weight of her own fears and creations. The landscape stretched out before her, an endless canvas of possibilities. But now, it wasn't just a place to escape to. It was her home, her sanctuary. The pain, the terror, the dark reflection that had haunted her every step, they had all melted away. In their place was clarity, peace. June stopped at the edge of the stream, gazing down at the water as it flowed gently over the smooth stones. The sunlight glinted off the surface, creating tiny ripples of gold. She could see her reflection in the water, distorted but beautiful, merging with the world around her. She smiled softly, realizing that, for the first time in a long time, she recognized herself. She knelt down, dipping her fingers into the cool stream. The water rushed over her hands, washing away the last remnants of the fear that had once held her in its grip. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the soft whispers of nature around her, letting herself fully absorb the tranquility that surrounded her. The painting, the darkness, the figure, they all felt like distant memories now, like fading echoes from a world she had left behind. She had created it, yes, but she had also escaped it. She had faced the fear, the twisted parts of herself, and now she had broken free. Her eyes fluttered open, and she stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. There was no need to rush, no need to run. The world was no longer something to escape. It was something to embrace, something to live within, as it was raw, beautiful, and untainted by her past creations. She turned away from the stream and began walking again, her steps slow but purposeful. Each breath felt like a new beginning, each moment a fresh start. The sky above was now a clear blue, the last remnants of the storm long gone. The sun warmed her skin, its light soft and golden, casting long shadows that stretched across the hills. June could hear the distant hum of life all around her, the rustling of grass beneath her feet, the whisper of the wind through the trees. She was a part of it now, a part of this peaceful, living world. Her thoughts wandered to the people who had once known her, to her past as a painter, to the world she had once tried to escape. She had been afraid for so long, afraid of her own creations, of the darkness that had lived inside her. But now she understood. She understood that the darkness had never defined her. It had only been a part of her journey, a part of the story she had needed to tell. And now that story was finished. She had learned to paint with light, with peace, with the quiet colors of life that no shadow could overpower. The canvas of her future was wide open, and this time it was not a place of fear, but a place of endless possibility. June stopped at the crest of a hill and looked out over Connemara one last time. The vast, rolling landscape stretched out before her, bathed in the gentle light of the morning. It was her world now, not as a painter, but as a person free, whole, and at peace. And as she stood there, breathing in the calm, she realized that this, right here, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had ever needed. As June stood there, on that crest of a hill, the world stretched out before her in a vast, endless expanse. The morning light bathed everything in soft gold, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land. The hills rolled gently into the distance, their green slopes a comforting embrace. The sky above was a soft, endless blue, the remnants of the storm having passed, leaving only peace in its wake. For the first time in so long, June felt no rush. There was no need to hurry, no need to move. She was here, in this moment, and that was enough. Her past, the fears, the darkness, the haunting figure, felt like distant memories, like clouds passing across the sky. They had no hold on her now. She had let them go. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, allowing herself to fully absorb the beauty around her, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of birds in the trees, the soft murmur of the stream flowing below. The sounds of nature were simple, soothing, like a lullaby that wrapped around her, comforting her soul. For so long, she had been running from herself, running from her own creations, her own fears, and the twisted reflection of her past. But now she stood still, no longer burdened by the need to escape. She was here. She was free. As her thoughts drifted, she felt a gentle breeze brush against her skin. It was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and the sweet fragrance of wildflowers. She smiled softly, feeling a connection to everything around her. The land, the sky, the trees, the stream. They were all a part of her now, and she a part of them. With her hand on her heart, June looked out once more at the landscape, the vast open canvas that lay before her. It was no longer a place of fear or of creation. It was simply a place of living, of existing, of being. And in that quiet moment, with the wind whispering through the trees and the sun warming her face, June finally understood. She didn't need to paint anymore. She didn't need to create a world or try to escape from one. The world she had created within her mind had faded, and now what remained was something even more beautiful. Something real. Something hers. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden glow across the hills, June took a final look at the land she had once known only through the strokes of a brush. It was here, in this place, that she had found her true self, not in the images she had painted, but in the world that had always been waiting for her to see it. And for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. With a soft sigh, June began to walk again, her footsteps light and steady, the path ahead clear, her heart full of quiet contentment. She was no longer running. She was simply living, and that was all she needed. The world stretched on before her, filled with endless possibilities, and June walked forward, each step a reminder that she had finally found her place. June walked for what felt like hours, the landscape of Connemara unfolding before her like a dream made real. Each step she took was a release, a letting go of the past. The quiet beauty of the land seemed to wrap around her, filling the spaces within her that had once been clouded with fear and uncertainty. The hills rose and fell, their curves smooth and inviting. The trees, tall and strong, whispered secrets in the wind, their leaves shimmering in the golden light. The scent of the earth, fresh rain, wildflowers, and the faint tang of salt from the distant sea filled the air, grounding her, reminding her that she was a part of this world. As she walked, her mind cleared. There were no more shadows following her steps, no more unsettling whispers or doubts. She was free of the burden she had carried for so long, and the weight of the world no longer pressed upon her shoulders. She had found peace. It was simple, quiet, and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. The path ahead was open, stretching into the horizon. She could go anywhere, do anything. The world was hers to explore, and yet she felt no urgency. There was no need to rush anymore. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to truly be present. The sound of a distant stream reached her ears, and she made her way toward it. As she neared, she saw the crystal-clear water winding through the valley, sparkling in the sunlight. She knelt beside the stream, dipping her fingers into the cool water. The sensation was soothing, calming, like the earth itself was offering her a quiet moment of reflection. She closed her eyes, letting the water flow over her skin, and for a moment, she imagined that she could hear the earth's heartbeat. The world felt alive, as if it were breathing with her. She was no longer just a spectator in her own life. She was part of the rhythm of this land, part of its pulse. After a while, June stood and continued her walk, following the stream as it wound through the valley. The world around her seemed to grow even more beautiful with each passing step, as though the land itself was welcoming her back, showing her its hidden wonders. The sun was now high in the sky, casting its warm rays across the land, and June felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. She had found what she had been searching for, not in the strokes of a paintbrush or the creation of worlds, but in the quiet simplicity of just being. She didn't need to paint anymore. She didn't need to create. The world had already been created, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had ever needed. As she walked on, June knew that she was home, not in a place, but in herself. And with each step, the world grew brighter, more alive, and more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth spread over the land, casting long shadows that danced gently across the hills. June's pace remained slow, purposeful, each step taken with a quiet sense of gratitude. The world around her seemed to hum with life, each sound, a bird's call, the rustling of leaves, the bubbling of the stream, seemed to speak directly to her heart, offering her a kind of reassurance she hadn't known she needed. She passed a grove of trees, their trunks thick and weathered, their branches sprawling high above, creating a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft beams. Beneath them, the ground was cool and soft, carpeted with moss and wildflowers. June paused, drawn to the serene beauty of the grove. The flowers, delicate and bright, seemed to nod in the breeze, as if in agreement with the peace she now felt. She knelt to touch the ground, her fingers grazing the moss, and a soft smile crept onto her face. The world, so vibrant and full of life, was no longer something to fear or escape from. She had been lost, yes, but she had also found something far more precious, her place in it all. She wasn't an observer, standing outside of the world, but a part of it. Connected, whole. Rising to her feet, she continued walking, the path before her as open and inviting as the world she had come to understand. The days of fear, of painting to escape, were behind her. The canvas of her life was no longer filled with shadows or stormy skies. It was painted in the soft, subtle hues of a world alive with possibility. The land around her began to change as she walked. The hills flattened, and soon she found herself standing at the edge of a wide, open plain. The grass here was tall, swaying gently in the breeze. Beyond, the coastline stretched out, a thin line where the ocean met the sky, both meeting in an endless horizon. The sea was calm, the water shimmering with a pale blue light that seemed to reflect the very peace she felt within herself. She took a deep breath, inhaling the salty air. For the first time, the ocean didn't seem vast and frightening. It felt expansive, yes, but in a way that felt freeing. The world stretched on before her, limitless and open. There were no boundaries anymore, no walls or fears that could confine her. As June stood there on the edge of the plain, she closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to absorb the stillness of the scene. The sea, the sky, the land, all of it was connected, flowing into each other in perfect harmony. She was a part of it. She always had been. It was only when she had tried to paint a world that was separate from herself that she had become lost. But now, standing at the edge of this vast world, she realized that she had never truly been apart from it. She had been searching for something, but it had always been here, within her reach, within her. She opened her eyes, gazing at the horizon one last time. The ocean sparkled under the light of the sun, and the world felt endless, yet perfectly balanced. The path ahead of her was clear, and she knew, deep in her heart, that she didn't need to seek out something beyond this moment. Everything she had ever needed was right here. Her smile deepened as she took a final breath, letting the peace of the world fill her completely. She was no longer the painter, no longer the woman who had created worlds to escape from herself. She was simply June, standing at the edge of life, ready to walk forward, no longer afraid of what lay ahead. And as she took the first step toward the sea, her heart light and free, she knew this was her true beginning. The ocean's whisper seemed to echo in her ears, soft and inviting as the wind tousled her hair. She walked forward, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready to embrace it with open arms. The world was hers, and for the first time, she was fully, completely a part of it. The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting the land in a warm, amber glow. The colors of the world around June seemed to deepen, the fading light creating a kind of magic that only came at twilight. The ocean, now in the distance, reflected the colors of the sky, burnished golds and purples stretching across the surface like a canvas of its own. The evening breeze carried the salty tang of the sea and the faint scent of earth, a perfect balance between land and water. June paused for a moment to take it all in, standing still at the edge of the plains, her eyes searching the horizon as the waves gently lapped at the shore below. The cool, salty air wrapped around her like a cloak, and she could feel the rhythm of the world beneath her feet. There was no hurry now, no rush to get anywhere. In this quiet moment, June realized that she had come full circle. She had once been afraid of this very stillness, of the emptiness she believed was lurking in the quiet spaces of her mind. But now, she knew better. The silence, the peace, it wasn't emptiness at all. It was wholeness. It was everything she had been searching for, and it had always been there. She felt the weight of her past, her fear, her paintings, the darkness that had once haunted her, begin to dissolve completely. It wasn't that those things had disappeared, but rather, they had found their place. They were no longer a burden. She had let go, allowed herself to be at peace with all of it. The past had been a part of her journey, but it no longer defined her. The sky above her now blushed with the softest pink, the last rays of the sun slipping beneath the horizon. June stepped forward, her feet light and steady on the earth. The coolness of the evening air kissed her skin, and she smiled, a sense of deep contentment filling her heart. There was nothing more she needed. Not a brushstroke, not another creation. The world was already beautiful as it was. The stars were beginning to twinkle above, and the first star that appeared seemed to guide her steps, twinkling like a quiet promise in the darkening sky. With a final glance at the land she had walked through, June continued toward the sea, her heart full and unburdened. The journey had brought her here, to this moment, to this peace. And with each step, she felt as though she was walking deeper into herself, toward the place where she truly belonged. The sound of the waves grew louder, and as June walked, she realized that she had found something far more important than any painting, any creation. She had found the art of simply being, and that, she knew, was enough. And as the night sky unfolded above her, she walked toward the horizon, no longer searching, but simply living, fully present, at peace with the world and with herself. The moon rose slowly, casting a silvery glow over the landscape, turning the sea into a shimmering expanse of light. The world had settled into a quiet stillness, a moment suspended between the fading day and the coming night. June stood at the water's edge, her bare feet sinking gently into the cool sand, her heart open to the vastness of the world around her. The stars above sparkled like tiny diamonds scattered across a dark velvet sky. There was no sound now except for the rhythmic lapping of the waves and the soft whisper of the wind through the grass behind her. It was as though time itself had paused, allowing her to simply be, to simply exist in the beauty of the moment. June took a deep breath, closing her eyes, feeling the cool breeze on her skin, the salt of the sea on her lips, and the warmth of the earth beneath her. She had walked far, not just through the hills of Connemara, but through the twists and turns of her own heart. The darkness that had once haunted her had lost its grip. It had been replaced with a quiet peace that she had never thought possible. In the distance, the soft glow of the town lights twinkled, but here, at the edge of the world, it felt as though she were the only person alive. The vastness of the ocean seemed to stretch out forever, a reminder that there was so much more beyond what she could see, yet she felt no longing, no desire to reach for it. She was content, as though she had come to a place of perfect harmony. As the waves kissed the shore, she thought of the life she had left behind, the paintings, the struggles, the fear. They were all part of her story, part of her journey, but they no longer defined her. The brushstrokes of her life had shifted, no longer constrained by the darkness she once feared. She had created something new, not through art, but through living. The quiet beauty of the world, the simplicity of being, was the masterpiece she had been searching for all along. And so, with one final look at the ocean, June turned away, walking slowly back toward the hills. The path ahead was no longer uncertain or shadowed. It was clear, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. She had found her way, not through her paintings, but through her heart. As she disappeared into the night, the stars above twinkled brighter, and the waves whispered their eternal song. The world continued its endless dance, and June, finally free, was a part of it, no longer bound, but at peace.